Gary, thank you for coming as well. We're looking forward to your presentation about international experience with purchasing fighter jets. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Dr. Gary Schaub. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Military Studies. And because I'm probably very new to many of you, I would like to simply tell you that prior to my posting here, taking this job at the university, I worked for the United States Air Force as a civil servant, as a faculty member at the United States Air War College. I was a founding fellow at the Air Force Research Institute, which studied these sorts of issues for the United States Air Force. And being a member of the Center for Military Studies for the past 4.5 years, I have produced a number of reports that deal with air power, from unmanned aerial vehicles to the lessons of the F-16, which I will reference a bit today. And thank you very much for coming and listening to what I have to say. Overall, I would like to begin by saying that I think that the assessment that has been done by the New Fighter Program Office actually looks very good in comparison to those done by other countries. So international comparisons in general should be favorable to the way in which Denmark has conducted this. And as we go through this presentation, I'm going to try to emphasize 3 lessons that have been derived from those experiences from other countries, primarily multilateralism, having clear communications about costs, and of course capability gaps. And then I will of course derive some conclusions. First, I want to talk a little bit about the context in which this is taking place. Air power is a strategic instrument. It is something that is very happily reached toward, if you will, by politicians who want to make a difference in international operations. And indeed, beyond it being a recognized niche capacity, particularly for the Danish Air Force, who have shown up in numerous operations since the Kosovo operation in 1999 and performed extremely well, it is a necessary defensive capability for maintaining the sovereignty of the kingdom. And that's not just Denmark proper, but also reaching up into Greenland. And so therefore, there are certain characteristics of aircraft that are helpful when one is looking at them. Denmark, however, is not necessarily unique in its current situation. And indeed, many of the aircraft that are currently in use by Western militaries, from the F-15 to the Tornado to the Gripen, were all developed and manufactured and purchased in the 1970s and the 1980s. All the countries that bought them thought that they had a life expectancy where they would have to replace those aircraft in their aircraft fleets around the turn of the century. Unfortunately for the age of the aircraft, if you will, but fortunately for the budgets of those countries, most of these countries chose to extend the life of the aircraft in order to refurbish them. So here in Denmark, for example, the life extension program that was undertaken, it was decided upon in the 1992 Defense Agreement, and for 1.1 billion kroner, the entire Danish Air Force, roughly 60 aircraft, were refurbished and taken from where they had slipped back to the back end of the capability spectrum, back up towards the front end. Now, of course, the choice was made because of tight budgetary situations and indeed the peace dividend after the Cold War, and importantly, assumptions that a next generation aircraft would be developed either in Europe or in the United States. Now, in the 2000s, unfortunately, some of the assumptions on which that refurbishment calculation was made were undermined by the increased use in international operations and delayed decisions by parliamentarians, in particular across all NATO and Western countries, because these are very expensive things to invest in, and it is very hard politically in order to make the case for doing so. This has resulted in rapidly aging fleets, and many of them that are reaching the end of their useful service life, and therefore leading to potential risks for the air forces themselves. Some of the lessons that could be derived from international experiences over the past decade or so of countries buying new aircraft start off with the first lesson, which is buying together and flying together. And that's because aircraft are increasingly complex increasingly expensive, and they take a very long time to be developed. Indeed, there are a few countries, primarily major powers, that have the capability in their aerospace industries to develop modern aircraft. Jet engines in particular are quite difficult to make work. This is, for example, where the Chinese are running into some difficulties. And they are increasingly expensive because they do a lot more than the basic Wright brothers Wright Flyer did back in 1908. Now, because of that, multinational solutions have been sought, and those have been of two types: foreign military sales, so a direct purchase, if you will, and also multinational programs in which a group of countries come together and try to come up with a common type of aircraft. Now, the F-16 program in and of itself was a great success from a multinational perspective. It was a foreign military sales cooperative program in which the United States Air Force cooperated with the air forces of Belgium, the Dutch, the Norwegians, and the Danes, so that in 1975, when Denmark purchased a fleet of F-16s and topped up from the original 58 over the years, they derived massive benefits from that consortium effort in terms of lower prices, the ability to affect the development of the airframe, fleet management, which allowed it to be, well, as we see in the current report, to squeeze out more flight hours per year if you possibly can, training and management. And I talk about this a great deal in this report, which has recently been translated into Danish as well. Now, the Joint Strike Fighter program was the Americans' effort to try to replicate the F-16 experience, but from the ground up. So starting with a multinational effort from the beginning, from the development of the aircraft, all the way through production and deployment. And rolling those lessons of the F-16 into that program has led to certain structural issues and benefits from participating in it. This is why Denmark, along with 8 other countries, joined the Joint Strike Fighter program back in 1997 and have paid subscription fees, if you will, every 4 or 5 years to continue to be members of that program. However, it's still a work in progress in that many of the follow-on things, not just the airframe and the development of them, but the training, the logistics trail, et cetera, these are all being developed as we speak. So for example, right now the Dutch are setting up a training program with the Italians so that they can together conserve flight hours when it comes to pilot training. The second big lesson from international experiences is clearly communicating costs of the program. Again, these are rather large programs. They have been compared to other large capital purchases by governments, particularly in the current debate here in Denmark. And because they are big and expensive and complex, they require clear and consistent communication. And that's clear and consistent communication between and within the ministries themselves, within the government, and to Parliament, and then finally with the public. And indeed, it's very possible that these large programs can go awry because, bearing in mind, it should be fairly obvious that once you clearly communicate about these issues, sometimes governments get confused. So for example, let's take the example of Canada. In 2008, the government of Stephen Harper committed themselves to purchasing 65 next-generation aircraft. In 2010, they made an announcement they were going to buy 65 F-35s. So first they announced a number, then they announced the actual type that they were going to go with. When the government rolled out that announcement, they said it would cost $9 billion. Parliamentarians took a look at this and asked the parliamentary budget officer to cost out the entire program. And he came back with a rather larger number, $29.3 billion. The Auditor General's Office of Canada then stepped in to sort out the dispute between the Parliament and the government, and his assessment was that it was going to cost $40 billion. The government of Prime Minister Harper didn't care for that very much and hired KPMG, an accounting firm, to do their own estimate, and the government did not get the response that they wanted. This looked like a program that was out of control and was politically unviable. So the Harper government set the pause button on it, and the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has continued with that pause, and they're going to, look at the entire competition again. Now the question here is, what was the underlying issue under dispute? Well, the government was talking about the flyaway costs of the aircraft. The Parliamentary Budget Officer was looking at a 30-year life cycle. The Auditor General's Office was looking at a 36-year life cycle. And KPMG thought that those planes would last for 42 years. And so, when you look at the averages, they were actually all looking at the same program, but the inability of that government to communicate with itself, with its own ministries, and with the Parliament and the public killed the program. So this is a message of forewarning as you go ahead and debate this, this rather large investment. Finally, the third lesson, of course, is minding the capability gap, which is going to be an issue, as has been talked about here today. When you transition from an old fleet to a new fleet, there's a possibility that things won't show up on time. So choreographing, retiring the old fleet and bringing in the new fleet is very important, and it's a management issue. Good management of the aircraft fleets and how they transition in and out can help avoid these gaps. And there are really, as Jacob and others have talked about a little bit here today, there are two things that you can do to manage the fleets. You can deal with sustainability issues, flying different mission profiles, looking at fewer flying hours or different types of flying hours, and also the types of missions that you engage in for operational relevance. Some missions are more threatening than others, for example, and so therefore put less strain and stress on the aircraft. Australia has a very nice example with their retirement of the F-111, which was a longer range bomber that they bought from the United States. They looked at the sustainment costs in 2003 and decided, although that airframe could last until 2020, they were going to retire 10 years earlier because it was just too darn expensive. At the time, they were considering, being a member of the Joint Strike Fighter program, replacing those with Joint Strike Fighters. But in 2007, in order to close the gap, the Parliament and the government agreed to spend $6 billion for 24 Super Hornets that would be in service for 15 years, at which time in 2025 they will be retired. Now, of course, they could be life extended or maybe sold on the secondhand international market. So there's something that they can do with regard to their fleet management that you can learn from there. Now, to take it back to Canada for a second, there were substantial consequences from the decision to reset their program. When the Harper government did that in 2012, they forced the issue with regard to flying their F-18s for a longer period of time. And when they did the analysis, they saw that they could extend those, which were going to be retired somewhere around 2017, to 2025 for $400 million. If they wanted to take it an extra 5 years, it was going to cost them 4 times as much, $1.5 billion. So there are certain issues here with regard to how long you can stretch things out and how much it costs to do so. Now, and I'll just refer back a little bit to the Danish experience, because something I really want to talk about in more detail is the chronic pilot shortage that Denmark experienced as it populated 4 F-16 squadrons. In basic shorthand, Denmark had enough pilots to populate 3 of those 4 squadrons, and I discussed this in the report on the lessons of the F-16. And of course, having fully manning your aircraft with pilots who are well-trained and capable is very key, because if they're not there, you can't use them. So capability gaps don't just have to deal with, or just do not deal only with platforms, but personnel, with maintenance. This was the issue last summer. And of course with munitions. If you run out of munitions, well, the aircraft can fly up there and do some things, but not a whole lot else. So in order to conclude these lessons, first, I want to emphasize that Denmark is not alone. There's a wave of recapitalization that is happening across aircraft fleets in the Western world in particular. And there are lots of lessons that can be learned from the ways in which they have managed their fleets, and ways in which they've run their analyses, positive lessons. No issues in Australia, for example, negative lessons, massive issues in Canada. Secondly, because these aircraft are extremely expensive and hard to build, and not every country has a large defense industrial base that can do it, states have gone with smart defense pooling and sharing arrangements, if you will, in order to bring down the average costs of buying into a fleet of aircraft. A user group, a community, is one of the standard things that happens regardless of who the manufacturer or who the country is, at least in the West. So there would be a user group for Gripen, for example, a user group for the Boeing FA-18, a user group for the JSF. And making an assessment of how those different user groups perform is something that could be subjected to further analysis. Third, an absence of clarity and communication, particularly about costs and the way in which programs work, can derail them. And that's a political lesson to be drawn. And then finally, from something that would be internal to the ministry and to the Royal Danish Air Force, capability gaps are choices. How you choose to manage the fleet transition from the old to the new is going to determine how long and how wide and how deep that lack of capability is. And other countries, both Canada and Australia, for example, have undertaken stopgap measures for an interim capability to fill that gap. And that's something else that could be layered on top of your discussions here. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.